The sky over occupied Europe looked calm, almost peaceful. From the ground, the formation of American bombers drifting through the clouds resembled silver birds gliding through sunlight. But inside one of those aircraft, peace did not exist. Inside that B-24 Liberator, every man knew death was already on board with them. It was February 1944. The war had reached a point where every mission meant heavier flak, faster fighters, and thinner chances of survival. The bomber crews had a saying, "Flak is black and fighters are silver, and both mean you might not come home." On this mission, 12 men sat inside the aluminum body of a bomber nicknamed Iron Saint. The aircraft had already flown more than 20 missions, which, statistically, meant it was overdue for disaster. Bombers didn't retire. They simply stopped coming back. At the controls sat Captain Daniel Reeves, a quiet pilot from Ohio whose calm voice had guided his crew through storms, engine failures, and enemy fighters. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Mark Ellis, kept scanning the instruments, his fingers tapping nervously against the yoke. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Every man aboard understood the risk. Behind them, the bombardier checked the Norden bomb site for the 5th time. The target that day was a heavily defended industrial complex supplying German armored divisions. Intelligence had warned them. Heavy anti-aircraft batteries, experienced gunners, and interceptors scrambled the moment bombers appeared. Still, the order had been clear. Hit the target, no matter what. The formation crossed the coastline. Within minutes, the sky erupted. Black bursts of flak exploded around them like thunderclouds detonating in midair. The plane shook violently as shock waves slapped its wings. Metal fragments rattled across the fuselage like hail. Someone in the rear shouted, not in panic, but in instinct, "Flak. Level at 10 o'clock." Captain Reeves tightened his grip. He held the bomber steady. Bombers had one defense against flak: maintain formation. Break formation, and you became an easy target for fighters. Stay together, and your guns overlapped into a shield of fire. Another explosion ripped nearby. The aircraft lurched sideways. Warning lights flashed red. "Engine 3 hit," yelled the flight engineer. Smoke began trailing behind the right wing. Inside the cockpit, the smell reached them first: hot oil and burning insulation. Reeves didn't turn. He simply said, calm as ever, "Feather it." The engineer shut down the damaged engine, turning the propeller blades to reduce drag. The plane steadied slightly, but now they were slower. Slower meant vulnerable, and the Germans knew it. Silver shapes appeared in the distance, fighters climbing fast. "Bandits at 3 o'clock," the tail gunner shouted. The formation tightened. Machine guns locked. Fingers hovered over triggers. The sky transformed from silent blue to screaming chaos. German fighters dove through the formation, cannons blazing. Tracers streaked past the cockpit glass like fiery needles. The gunners fired back, their .50 caliber machine guns shaking the aircraft with each burst. One fighter flashed past, so close the crew could see the pilot's goggles. Then it happened. A shell burst directly beneath the B-24's belly. The explosion slammed upward into the fuselage. The bomber jolted violently. Warning sirens screamed. Flames erupted along the wing route. "Fire! Fire in the bomb bay." The words froze the air. Fire in the bomb bay meant only one thing. If the flames reached the payload, the aircraft wouldn't explode. It would vanish. Inside the narrow fuselage, men stared at each other, understanding instantly what they were facing. The intercom crackled with overlapping voices. Smoke thickened. Heat spread along the floor panels. Lieutenant Ellis looked at the pilot. "Dan, we gotta bail." It was the logical choice. Standard protocol. Survival. But Captain Reeves didn't answer. Instead, he looked forward through the windshield. Ahead, miles away but visible through breaks in the cloud, lay the target. The mission, the reason they were there. Another blast rocked the bomber. Flames crawled along the interior panels like living creatures. The radio operator coughed as smoke filled his lungs. Someone in the back was praying. Someone else was laughing nervously. Another crewman clutched his parachute harness but didn't move. Ellis repeated, louder now, "Dan, we can't hold her. We jump now, or we don't jump at all." Still Reeves said nothing, because in his mind, a different calculation was running. If they jumped now, they would live. Most of them, at least. If they stayed, they could still hit the target. And if they hit it, They might cripple a factory producing tanks that would kill hundreds of Allied soldiers on the ground. The bomber shuddered again. Flames burst through a panel behind the cockpit. Decision time was gone. Only choice remained. Reeves pressed the intercom button. His voice came through every headset, steady, clear, almost gentle. "Boys, we can still make it." Silence followed. No one asked what he meant, because they understood. He wasn't talking about survival. He was talking about the mission. In the nose compartment, the bombardier slowly lowered himself back onto the site. Behind him, the gunner released his parachute straps and turned back to his weapon. One by one, each crew member made the same decision. No vote, no order, just understanding. They could have jumped. Instead, they stayed. The B-24, trailing smoke and flame, limped forward toward the most heavily defended point in the sky. German gunners on the ground spotted it immediately. A burning bomber was an easy kill, a wounded animal limping toward hunters. Flak batteries adjusted their aim. The sky around Iron Saint turned black with explosions. Inside, the temperature rose. Paint blistered. Wiring melted. The control yoke grew hot in Reeves's hands. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he didn't blink. "Bombardier," he said quietly. "How long?" The reply came through coughing smoke. 2 minutes. 2 minutes in a burning aircraft was a lifetime. Another explosion slammed into the tail section. The aircraft lurched downward. Alarms shrieked. The engineer shouted something unintelligible over the roar. Ellis gritted his teeth. "She's not going to hold." Reeves pushed the throttles forward on the remaining engines. "She will." Outside, the target grew larger. Inside, the fire spread closer to the bomb bay. Time was running out. The bomber was dying. Inside the fuselage, the sound of fire had become its own living creature. A low, hungry roar crawling through metal ribs and wiring bundles. Smoke thickened into choking clouds. The floor vibrated violently beneath their boots as the remaining engines strained to keep the crippled aircraft in the sky. Captain Reeves didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the aircraft fading through the controls, the sluggish response, the trembling frame, the desperate resistance of a machine that knew it was running out of time. Bombardier status. In the nose compartment, Lieutenant Harris wiped soot from his goggles. Through the Norden sight, the world below looked strangely calm. Factories, rail lines, smokestacks, the geometry of war production. Anti-aircraft bursts blossomed around them like black flowers. Target in sight. Adjusting. Hold her steady. Hold her steady. Reeves almost smiled at the irony. The aircraft was burning from the inside out, and still his bombardier asked for steadiness, because accuracy meant everything. A missed drop meant the mission failed. A failed mission meant the sacrifice meant nothing. Another flak burst detonated close off the right wing. The aircraft rolled sharply. One of the gunners muttered a prayer under his breath. Another simply stared forward, jaw clenched, eyes steady. No one reached for a parachute, because now it was too late anyway. The fighters peeled away again, unwilling to fly too close to a bomber that looked ready to explode at any moment. Even enemy pilots respected the danger of a burning aircraft loaded with bombs. The target filled the bombardier's sight. Wind buffeted the plane violently. Smoke curled across the glass. The crosshairs drifted, slid, fought him. He adjusted knobs, breathing slowly despite the heat baking his face. Steady, steady. Reeves locked his arms against the yoke, muscles rigid. The aircraft shook like it was coming apart bolt by bolt. Sweat poured down his temples. The control column vibrated so violently it numbed his hands. The world narrowed. No flak. No fighters. No fire. Only the target. 10 seconds. The flames burst brighter behind the cockpit. Something structural snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the fuselage. Ellis whispered, almost to himself, "Come on. Come on." Harris inhaled sharply. Bombs away. A heavy metallic thud echoed beneath them as the payload released. Instantly, the aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter, as if it had exhaled its final breath. Below them, the bombs fell. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the earth erupted. Explosions tore across the factory complex in a chain of violent blossoms. Buildings shattered. Fireballs rolled skyward. Shockwaves rippled through smoke and debris. Even from thousands of feet above, the crew could see the destruction spreading across the target. One of the gunners muttered a prayer under his breath. Another simply stared forward, jaw clenched, eyes steady. No one reached for a parachute, because now it was too late anyway. The fighters peeled away again, unwilling to fly too close to a bomber that looked ready to explode at any moment. Even enemy pilots respected the danger of a burning aircraft loaded with bombs. The target filled the bombardier's sight. Wind buffeted the plane violently. Smoke curled across the glass. The crosshairs drifted, slid, fought him. He adjusted knobs, breathing slowly despite the heat baking his face. Steady, steady. Reeves locked his arms against the yoke, muscles rigid. The aircraft shook like it was coming apart bolt by bolt. Sweat poured down his temples. The control column vibrated so violently it numbed his hands. The world narrowed. No flak. No fighters. No fire. Only the target. 10 seconds. The flames burst brighter behind the cockpit. Something structural snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the fuselage. Ellis whispered, almost to himself, "Come on. Come on." Harris inhaled sharply. Bombs away. A heavy metallic thud echoed beneath them as the payload released. Instantly, the aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter, as if it had exhaled its final breath. Below them, the bombs fell. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the earth erupted. Explosions tore across the factory complex in a chain of violent blossoms. Buildings shattered. Fireballs rolled skyward. Shockwaves rippled through smoke and debris. Even from thousands of feet above, the crew could see the destruction spreading across the target. The ground rose toward them like a wall. From below, German soldiers stationed near the shattered factory watched the burning bomber spiral out of the clouds. At first they thought it was already destroyed, just wreckage falling from the sky. But then they realized something strange. The plane was still intact, still descending in one piece, still flying in its own doomed way. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reeves could no longer see the instruments. Flames crawled across the panel, devouring gauges and switches. The windshield was streaked with soot, smoke swirling so thick it turned daylight into a dim orange haze. Every breath burned his lungs. Yet his hands remained on the yoke, not because it worked anymore, but because letting go would mean admitting the end had come. Behind him, the fuselage groaned, a deep metallic scream like a ship breaking apart in a storm. Rivets snapped, panels warped. Somewhere in the rear section, ammunition cooked off in sharp popping bursts as heat ignited the rounds. Lieutenant Ellis coughed violently, pulling his sleeve over his mouth. His eyes were red, barely open. Still, he turned his head toward the pilot. "Dan." Reeves didn't look away from the windshield. "Yeah." Ellis swallowed. His voice was hoarse, raw from smoke. "We did it." A faint nod. The ground rose toward them like a wall. From below, German soldiers stationed near the shattered factory watched the burning bomber spiral out of the clouds. At first they thought it was already destroyed, just wreckage falling from the sky. But then they realized something strange. The plane was still intact, still descending in one piece, still flying in its own doomed way. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reeves could no longer see the instruments. Flames crawled across the panel, devouring gauges and switches. The windshield was streaked with soot, smoke swirling so thick it turned daylight into a dim orange haze. Every breath burned his lungs. Yet his hands remained on the yoke, not because it worked anymore, but because letting go would mean admitting the end had come. Behind him, the fuselage groaned, a deep metallic scream like a ship breaking apart in a storm. Rivets snapped, panels warped. Somewhere in the rear section, ammunition cooked off in sharp popping bursts as heat ignited the rounds. Lieutenant Ellis coughed violently, pulling his sleeve over his mouth. His eyes were red, barely open. Still, he turned his head toward the pilot. "Dan." Reeves didn't look away from the windshield. "Yeah." Ellis swallowed. His voice was hoarse, raw from smoke. "We did it." A faint nod. Below them, the factory burned, a spreading inferno of secondary explosions, collapsing structures, and rising columns of black smoke. The strike had landed perfectly. Even from their falling aircraft, they could see the devastation. The target was gone. Mission accomplished. For a strange moment, calm settled over the cockpit. The terror, the noise, the alarms, all of it faded behind a quiet realization shared by every man on board. They had chosen this. Not been ordered. Not been forced. Chosen. Outside, Wind screamed past the fuselage as altitude bled away. The bomber tilted sharply, entering a tightening spiral. One wing burned brighter than the other, flames streaming backward like a comet tail. On the ground, German anti-aircraft crews stopped firing. Rifles lowered. Heads tilted upward. Even enemy soldiers, hardened by years of war, felt something they couldn't quite name as they watched the falling aircraft. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was awe, because they understood what they were seeing. Not a kill, a sacrifice. Inside the waist section, one of the gunners slid down against the fuselage wall as the aircraft tilted. His gloves were blackened with soot. Sweat carved clean lines through the grime on his face. He could hear the fire closing in behind him, crackling louder with every second. He didn't move, didn't run, just whispered quietly, almost peacefully, "Tell my mom." I stayed. The intercom was already dead. No one heard him. The tail section suddenly jolted violently. A structural beam gave way with a thunderous snap. The aircraft lurched again, nose dropping steeper. Altitude, barely a few thousand feet now. Reeves felt it instantly, that final, irreversible descent. Even without instruments, a pilot knows when gravity has truly taken control. He tightened his grip on the yoke anyway, not to save the plane, just to hold it steady until the last possible second. Beside him, Ellis leaned back in his seat, exhausted, smoke drifting around him like fog. For a brief instant, the chaos faded from his mind, and he saw something else instead, a memory. Blue sky, grass, home. His lips curved slightly. Outside, the burning bomber tore through the last layer of cloud. The ground exploded into view beneath them, fields, trees, roads, shattered buildings from the bombing run. Details rushed upward at terrifying speed. The fire reached the cockpit. Flames curled along the edges of Reeves's flight jacket. Heat blistered the paint off the control column. The roar inside the aircraft became deafening. Wind, fire, tearing metal, all blending into a single unstoppable sound. The bomber rolled once, twice, then stabilized for a brief, impossible moment, as if the aircraft itself wanted to face the earth head-on. On the ground, soldiers stared upward, frozen. The falling plane looked almost majestic, a blazing star descending from the sky. Inside, Reeves whispered one final sentence, not into the intercom, not to his crew, but to the aircraft itself. "Easy, girl." The earth filled the windshield. Light. Fire. Impact. Impact didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like the sky tearing apart. The burning B-24 struck the earth just beyond the shattered factory complex, its flaming fuselage slamming into the frozen ground with the force of a falling meteor. For a split second, there was only a violent flash of orange light. Then the sound arrived, a deep, thunderous crack that rolled across the countryside like a shockwave from the heavens. Soil, metal, and fire blasted upward together. The wreckage carved a scar into the earth hundreds of feet long, scattering fragments of aluminum skin and shattered machinery across the field. Flames roared skyward, black smoke twisting into a column visible for miles. Even hardened German soldiers who had watched countless aircraft fall felt the concussion in their chests. No one cheered. No one spoke. They simply stared, because they knew what they had witnessed wasn't ordinary combat. It was something else, something deliberate. A German sergeant standing near an anti-aircraft battery lowered his binoculars slowly. Moments earlier, he had been tracking the bomber, ready to fire if it somehow pulled out of its dive. But as he watched it descend, burning, crippled, yet still pointed toward its target, he had realized something that made him stop giving orders. "They didn't jump," he muttered. One of the younger soldiers beside him frowned. "What?" The sergeant didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the wreckage site, flames flickering in their reflection. They chose not to. Silence spread through the gun crew. War had taught them many things: how to fight, how to survive, how to obey. But moments like this reminded them of something harder to explain, that courage could exist on either side of a battlefield. In the distance, pieces of the destroyed factory still burned. Secondary explosions continued to rumble as ammunition stores ignited. The strike had done exactly what it was meant to do. Production there would not resume for a long time, which meant the mission had succeeded. Hours later, German recovery teams approached the crash site cautiously. The wreckage was still hot, twisted metal hissing as snow melted around it. The aircraft no longer resembled a plane. It looked like the skeleton of some enormous beast that had fallen from the sky. They expected to find parachutes scattered nearby. They found none. Only the shattered remains of the bomber and the men who had stayed with it until the end. One of the officers on site removed his cap, not out of regulation, but out of instinct. The gesture spread quietly among the soldiers until several stood bareheaded in the cold wind, facing the wreckage. No orders had been given. Respect didn't need orders. Back across the English Channel, the bomber group waited. It meant that courage wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic speeches or heroic poses. Sometimes courage was simply this: staying. Years after the war ended, historians reviewing combat records found fragments of the mission report, eyewitness accounts, and German field notes describing the falling aircraft. When pieced together, they revealed the full truth, not just of how the bomber died, but how its crew chose to meet that moment. They could have jumped. They had parachutes. They had time. They had a chance. Instead, they finished the mission. Today, no monument marks the exact spot where the bomber fell. The field has long since returned to grass. Wind moves across it the same way it did that day. Birds pass overhead, unaware of what once happened there. But history remembers. Because wars are not only shaped by victories, they are shaped by decisions. And on one burning morning in 1944, inside a dying aircraft over enemy territory, 12 men made a decision that turned a doomed mission into a legend. Not because they were ordered, not because they had to, but because they chose to.